So hi, I'm Jess and I work for the Wales Resilient Ecological Network, which I'll tell you a bit more about shortly. And today I'm going to talk to you about invasive species in South Wales. So before I start, I'm just going to go over a bit of my background. So I have a BSc in marine biology from Swansea University. I then went on to get my MRes, so Masters of Research, also at Swansea, where I studied visual recognition in lumpfish, which are these weird and wonderful fish in the pictures. They're pretty cool, but I'm not going to talk about those today. The start of my journey working on invasive species started following my Masters in 2018 when I started my PhD. For my PhD, I studied brown trout in the Falkland Islands and assessed the invasion ecology, distribution, and impact on native species. And as part of my fieldwork, I spent around 5 months in the Falklands working with fishermen to collect brown trout samples and also samples of environmental DNA. And I also got to see some penguins, which was pretty amazing. I then handed in my PhD and started working for WAREN as the project officer for South and Mid Wales in July 2021. So today I'm going to talk to you about invasive species and why they are an issue. Then I'm going to focus more on garden escapes and Himalayan balsam before introducing the WAREN project and how you can help tackle invasive species. So what invasive species? What are they? Invasive non-native species, also referred to as INS, invasive alien species, or just invasive species, are species which have been introduced by humans outside of their native range and have negative impacts. So their introduction can be intentional or accidental. The spread of invasive species threatens native biodiversity and can cause damage to the environment, the economy, and our health, as well as the way we live. Invasive species can have many negative impacts of the environment. For example, they can compete for resources such as light and water. They can also predate on native species, carry new diseases, and hybridize. So this is where invasive species breed with closely related native species. Invasive species have been identified as one of the top 5 threats to biodiversity globally by the Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, along with changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation, climate change, and pollution. Invasive species are estimated to cost Wales, at least 125 million in 2010 alone, and this cost is only likely to be increasing. Montbretia is a garden plant you may all recognise. It was introduced in 1880, and by 1911 it had escaped, and in the latter part of the 20th century it had rapidly spread across the UK. You will also definitely recognise this species, which is the grey squirrel. So they were introduced from America in 1828, and they compete with the native species for food, but they also carry a disease which is deadly to our native red squirrels. Another popular garden plant is butterfly bush. So Buddleia was introduced in the 1890s as an ornamental garden plant, and it has now spread and can often be found along railways and in urban areas. And then signal crayfish was introduced from North America in 1975. It competes with our native white-clawed crayfish for food. It also predates on river life and carries the crayfish plague. And then finally, another invasive species that probably everyone will recognise is Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed was introduced from Japan in 1886, and it has proved to be very difficult to remove and can even grow through cracks in walls and in concrete. So Wales has developed an invasive priority species for action list. This list follows the Convention on Biological Diversity 3-stage hierarchical approach and takes into account the risk posed by species, whether or not effective, strategic, and sustainable management is possible. The list splits species into prevention priorities, so species that are not yet present in Wales but are likely to arrive, and if detected, would require a rapid response. So this is species such as the Asian hornet. It also splits species into management priorities. So these are species that are recently present in the wild or in Wales in low numbers or in isolated populations, and where eradication is required and possible. And it would be feasible to prevent their widespread establishment. So this is species like piri-piri bird, which is this middle picture. And then finally, we have long-term management species. These are the species that are prioritised for this because they are established in Wales and where long-term management is feasible and beneficial. So this could be species like American mink, or also giant hogweed or rhododendron. So now we're going to talk to you about garden escapes. There are around 81,000 ornamental plants available to gardeners in Britain, and most of us will have non-native plants. So plants that are originally from other parts of the world in our gardens. And while these non-native species can help us create beautiful ornamental displays, a small proportion of them have and continue to escape into the wild and become invasive. These are the ones which are harmful to our wildlife and our environment. Ornamental horticulture is one of the main introduction pathways or sources of invasive species spread, with many invasive species originally being introduced to gardens and ponds, but later spread in or were deliberately planted out in the wild. But you may be thinking, why are invasive plants a problem? Plants are vital to our health and environment. They support biodiversity and ecosystem services, for example, by providing improving air quality. They can also help boost our mood and benefit both our physical and mental health, as well as helping to mitigate the impacts of climate change and provide a home for other wildlife. So why is it an issue to introduce these new plants from elsewhere in the world? Surely they can only benefit us. However, the wrong plant in the wrong place can harm the environment, and this damage can be irreversible. Invasive plants harm the native species by spreading pests and plant diseases. For example, rhododendron is a host of the plant diseases Phytophthora remora and Phytophthora kernovi. Sorry for my terrible pronunciation. So these are both serious threat to native species, including oak, beech, and larch. Invasive plants can also threaten rare habitats and wildlife. Some species are dependent on only a single plant. For example, the highly endangered tansy beetle was reduced to a single population when its sole food source, the native tansy plant, became rare. This partly occurred due to competition from invasive Himalayan balsam. The introduction of invasive plants can also impact native species through competition for resources such as light and nutrients. This can lead to reduced biodiversity in areas due to invasive species crowding out native plants, or by altering the habitat, nutrient composition, and acidity of the soil, therefore preventing native species from growing. Invasive plants are also known to block waterways and overgrow in ponds and lakes, forcing native wildlife out and causing flooding. Plants that grow along riverbanks, such as Himalayan balsam, are also a problem, as when they die back over winter, they leave the riverbank bare, unstable, and vulnerable to erosion, increasing the risk of flooding. In addition, invasive plants can harm the economy and our local communities by interfering with agriculture and utilities. Japanese knotweed, for example, is extremely difficult to eradicate and can cause structural damage to roads and houses by growing through asphalt and concrete. This can lead to significant delays and costs in development, and is currently estimated to cost developers £150 million a year to deal with Japanese knotweed alone. Invasive plants can also make it harder for us to take part in recreational activities, such as fishing, sailing, or paddling. Large mats of invasive aquatic plants can be difficult for boats, canoes, and kayaks to pass through. and they can also interfere with angling and block access to rivers. So under the right conditions, floating pennywort can grow up to 20 centimetres a day. It can rapidly form dense mats which affect oxygen levels in the water, damage the habitat, and crowd out and kill off native wildlife. And finally, invasive plants can also affect our health. For example, a tiny amount of sap from the giant hogweed plant can cause nasty skin blistering when exposed to sunlight. And the affected area can remain vulnerable for several years. Now on to Himalayan balsam. Himalayan balsam is a tall, attractive annual herb with explosive seed heads. It is native to the Himalayas and was first introduced to the UK in 1839. The first recorded in the wild then in 1855. Due to its aesthetic appeal, it was deliberately planted and now is widespread in the UK, especially along urban rivers. So we have created this heat map of Himalayan balsam distribution in Wales using data from the NBN Atlas for 2010 to 2019. And as you can see, Himalayan balsam is well distributed throughout Wales, particularly in South Wales. Although this heat map does have some biases due to the data being linked to population density, it still provides a good visual aid for when looking at species distribution and the problem that invasive species can pose. Himalayan balsam can spread solely by seeds, and each plant can produce as many as 800 seeds, which can be dispersed up to 7 meters away from the parent plant using its explosive seed pods. The seeds remain viable for up to 2 years in the soil in the seed bank. And seeds can also be transported on footwear and in clothing. That's why biosecurity is very important. Not only can Himalayan balsam be transported by seeds attaching to your footwear or clothing, but it can also be easily spread and transported by wind or water, especially in water, as the seeds are they can float and they're waterproof. So Himalayan balsam can outcompete native species, and it particularly grows along riverbanks where it grows in dense strands and can impede flow and increase the likelihood of flooding. So in the winter, the plant dies back, leaving the riverbanks bare and exposed to erosion. Himalayan balsam is listed under the Schedule 9 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981, which makes it an offence to plant or allow this species to grow in the wild. So therefore, its management is really important, and Himalayan balsam is a long-term management priority species for Wales. So the control of Himalayan balsam is relatively simple. It can be easily carried out without a need for a license and technical expertise. So although balsam can be controlled using chemical herbicide treatments, it is also very easily controlled by pulling, strimming, or cutting, and they can just be just as effective as chemicals. So control should be carried out before the plant begins seeding, which is usually around the end of July and into August. And it needs to be done before it seeds in order to prevent any further spread by you accidentally carrying the seeds around. So it may take a few years to control and for control to be effective and to eradicate the balsam from the area. And this is mainly due to you needing to remove the seed bank, which can last up to 2 years. Due to this dispersive nature of Himalayan balsam and its ability to be transported downstream in water, control work needs to be carried out using a coordinated approach, working down from the top of the catchment, starting at the uppermost reaches of its distribution. So pulling balsam is really easy to do, and anyone should be able to get involved and do it. All you need to do is pull up the plant. This is normally is best if you can pull it up low to the ground near the base of the plant, as the root system is very shallow. You should be able to the plant should come up very easily. All you need to do then is snap the stem at the bottom of the node to prevent regrowth, and then you can either hang the pulled plant over a tree branch or fence, or create a big pile which will compost down. So that was just a brief introduction to invasive species and in particular Himalayan balsam. Now I'm going to focus on the WAREN project. So the Wales Resilient Ecological Network, or WAREN project, is funded by Welsh Government Sustainable Management Scheme until April 2023. WAREN will promote biodiversity and ecological resilience by developing a collaborative and sustainable approach or framework for tackling invasive species across Wales. We will achieve this by developing linkages between projects, stakeholders, and local action groups. So WAREN I was a pilot project run from 2020 to 2021 and achieved several objectives, including engaging with stakeholders through a survey to identify the gaps, barriers, and opportunities for invasive species management in Wales, analysis of invasive species impacts and distribution, and it also scoped toolkits and action recording tools. WAREN II has 23 objectives to meet, which fall under a few general themes. These are a strategic approach, collaboration, raising awareness, and local action groups. So I'm going to touch on some of these themes today and discuss them in more detail throughout the presentation. So now I'm going to talk about what we can do to tackle invasive species. And first I'm going to talk about and focus on raising awareness. So the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat has been organising Invasive Species Week for many years. This is an annual national event to raise awareness of the impacts of invasive species and celebrate action in preventing their spread. This year, Invasive Species Week is running from the 16th to the 22nd of May, and each day focuses on a different theme. The Monday is focusing on invasive species impacts on the terrestrial environment. Tuesday, the focus is on impacts of the freshwater environment. On Wednesday, the focus is on impacts on the marine environment. On Thursday, the focus is on impacts on people and the urban environment. And on Friday, it's on biosecurity, with Saturday and Sunday both being for events. So I'm currently organising events for Invasive Species Week throughout the week across South Wales. So for example, on the Friday where we're focused on biosecurity, I'm going to be holding a balsam training day and biosecurity training day in the Wye Valley, whereas on the Monday, I'm hoping to hold an event at Parkslip. So I'm currently organising these events, but if you'd like to get involved or you have any ideas of events you'd like to do, please do let me know and get in touch. So WAREN is also going to be running its own campaign this year. This campaign will run from Invasive Species Week throughout the summer. And so it will run starting in Invasive Species Week on the Saturday and run until August, where we hope to attend the National Eisteddfod. Our campaign is called Ledwyr Ecosystem, or Ecosystem Invaders, and it aims to increase the awareness of invasive species and their impacts in Wales. So as this is an awareness raising campaign, we will be targeting groups that easily come into contact with invasive species, but may not necessarily know about invasive species, what they are and why they're a problem. So therefore we'll be targeting gardeners, recreational water users and exotic pet owners. So we're looking forward to confirming our launch at the National Botanic Gardens of Wales on the 22nd of May. So you can also help tackle invasive species by getting involved with local action groups. So a local action group is typically a volunteer-run community group set up to tackle local issues. So in the case of invasive species, a local action group often carries out work on the ground and is directly involved in the management of invasive species in their area. WAREN is finding local action groups across Wales, building a network of stakeholders and joining up volunteer effort to support the formation of new local action groups. We have met with and spoken to local action groups across Wales to see what they want and what they need to help them tackle invasive species and help them with their efforts. So if you're interested in joining or starting your own local action group, our invasive species toolkit may be of interest to you. Our toolkit will be a one-stop shop of information on invasive species and their management in Wales. Firstly, this toolkit will include and link to comprehensive identification guides for invasive species throughout Wales and highlight which species are currently considered a priority for action in Wales. We will also include best practice management guides for tackling Welsh priority invasive species. And as one of the core principles of WAREN is not to duplicate effort, we will, where possible, link to the current best practice. If this is not possible, we will collect information from a variety of sources, including the wildlife trusts, partner organisations, stakeholders, local action groups, and scientific literature to produce our own management guides. We will also include a project planning section, where we will discuss how to set up your own local action group or project. And as we want to make it as easy as possible for as many people to set up a new local action group, this section will also include templates, for example, of risk assessments, strategic action plans, and volunteer forms. We'll also include a biosecurity section, which will include information on why biosecurity is important, as well as biosecurity best practice. And finally, the toolkit will contain information on how local action groups can help spread awareness about invasive species and their impacts in Wales. To do this, the toolkit will include information and answers to frequently asked questions about invasive species, links to existing campaigns, and additional awareness-raising resources. So the plan is for this toolkit to be hosted on the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat website, but it will also be available to download as a PDF and ready to release this year before our invasive species campaign starts in May. And as I have already mentioned, we have spoken to local action groups across Wales to see what they want and need to help them with their efforts to tackle invasive species. And as a result, we're planning to hold training and topical surgeries this year to help local action groups. So these training days or topical surgeries could be on invasive species ID, different management techniques for different invasive species, biosecurity, or herbicide spray training to allow local action groups to branch out and tackle more invasive species. We are open to helping and providing any training that local action groups think would be beneficial to them. So next I'm going to focus on Plant Alert. Plant Alert is a citizen science project for gardeners to help protect the countryside by warning about invasive plants before they become a problem. So as we've already discussed, a lot of people have non-native plants in their gardens. And while there are benefits to this, it is really important to know at an early stage which of these plants may go on to endanger habitats outside of your gardens. This is something gardeners can play a crucial and huge role in, as they are the ones that will notice if any of their ornamental plants show the first signs of invasiveness. The information collected by Plant Alert is then used by the Centre of Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry University and the BSBI, so the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and contributes to species risk assessments and to provide advice for gardeners and nurseries. Many ornamental plants in your garden will spread, and this is a sign that they are growing well. But Plant Alert wants to know about those that are spreading to an extent that you have to control them or prevent them overgrowing other parts of your garden or other plants. So into areas where you may not necessarily want them. So it's really easy to report a potentially invasive plant. All you have to do is fill in their online survey, which is divided into 3 sections and usually takes between 15 to 20 minutes to complete. The survey also allows you to include photos of the plant in question, and this allows researchers to see its behaviour and confirm its identification. So far, 391 surveys have been received and 224 different species have been recorded, with Himalayan honeysuckle, fox and clubs, and 3-corned garlic being some of the most frequently reported plants on Plant Alert. So next we're going to focus on biosecurity, which is a really big part of WAREN, and we're very keen to promote biosecurity wherever we can. I think it's very important in tackling invasive species and stopping their spread. So biosecurity is the term given to any protection or precautionary step to reduce the introduction and spread of invasive species or other harmful organisms, for example, diseases. So biosecurity can take many forms, but typically involves simple practices such as cleaning equipment, vehicles, footwear, and this all needs to be done, especially between sites, to reduce the transfer of invasive species. So we can all easily be more biosecurity conscious by taking small precautions, which will require very little time and resources. For example, clean your boots after a walk and follow Check, Clean, Dry. So there are currently 3 national campaigns. These are Check, Clean, Dry, Be Plant Wise, and Keep It Clean, and each focus on biosecurity in a different setting, although the general principles of Check, Clean, Dry can be followed under any situation, regardless of whether you've been in contact with water. So Check, Clean, Dry is promoting you to always check your equipment and clothing and remove anything you find and leave it on site. Clean up everything thoroughly as soon as you can and leave everything to dry for as long as possible before you use it again. And as we've mostly been talking about plants today, I'm going to focus mainly on the biosecurity campaign, which is Be Plant Wise. So as we've already talked about, most of the plants in our garden are not native to the UK, and if they escape into the wild, they can harm our wildlife and environment. So Be Plant Wise was a campaign set up in 2010 to raise awareness of the detrimental impacts caused by invasive plants and to promote their action to stop their spread, for example, by properly disposing of plant material. Be Plant Wise has developed simple tips and guidance that anyone can follow to help them protect the environment while still enabling people to enjoy their gardens. So first of all, it's important to know what you grow and choose the right plants for your garden, pond, aquarium, or water feature. So Be Plant Wise suggests before buying a plant, make sure you do your research. Are the plants suitable for your needs? Are they easy to dispose of? Or could they become a problem and could they become invasive? Could you use native plants or non-invasive, non-native alternatives instead? And to never take plants from the wild. So this can be illegal and may also damage the environment. And then finally, Be Plant Wise suggests to be very careful when sharing plants with friends and family, as you could accidentally pass on invasive species, pests, or diseases. And in some cases, it is against the law to share or sell some plants. So the next action of Be Plant Wise is to stop the spread. So the aim of this is to make sure you are keeping your plants in your garden and don't allow them to escape and grow in the wild. So you want to let local native plants grow and flourish in the wild. So you need to be sure to keep your plants in your garden and never dispose of any garden plants or garden waste in the wild. So some of the suggestions to help stop the spread are to pull out any runners or seedlings and try to position new plants away from the edges of your garden to help stop plants jumping the fence and spreading into the wild. Also be sure to clean your garden tools especially if they've been used elsewhere, either in other people's gardens or for voluntary work. Otherwise, you could accidentally be bringing invasive species into your garden, or also plant diseases and pests. Or if you do have an invasive species or non-native species in your garden, you could be transporting them elsewhere. So yeah, as I said, By cleaning your tools, especially where they've been used elsewhere, it'll help keep them free of any plant fragments, seeds, and diseases. And then the final tip from Be Plant Wise is to compost with care. So to be sure you're disposing of any unwanted plants, roots, weeds, and seeds correctly and responsibly. Make sure you do not dump or fly tip any green waste, as this can have irreversible impact on the environment. Try to compost your plants at home where you can, and it's important to check whether you can compost your plants, as some invasive species cannot be composted. If you cannot compost your plants at home, keep an eye out. If you can compost your plants at home, it is also essential to keep an eye out for any regrowth. Alternatively, most garden plants can go in your council green waste bins. However, some invasive species have extra controls around their disposal, which you need to check and be aware of. For example, you can't compost Japanese knotweed, and it also can't go into your garden green bins. It needs to be disposed of properly to ensure that it doesn't spread. Be Plant Wise has also developed extra tips for pond and aquarium plants. For example, before you put a new plant in your pond, make sure to remove the surface layer of compost and wash the plant out in the bucket. Try to avoid using plants which are not locally native. And if any invasive plants do appear in your pond, make sure to remove them before they spread into the wild. When removing plants from your pond, try to leave them on the edge to drain for a few hours before disposing of them, as this allows any wildlife that is currently hiding out in them to return to the water. And also never release any animals or fish from your pond or pets into the wild. So for example, if you have goldfish, don't be releasing them anywhere, as that can be really bad for the environment. So I've actually gone through this presentation a lot quicker than I thought I would. I must have been talking really fast, so I'll just go over to conclude. So to conclude, you can help tackle invasive species in Wales by joining or setting up a local action group, organising a balsam bash in your local area, or going along and helping out at a balsam bash in your local area, by raising awareness of invasive species. So you can do this during Invasive Species Week, which is running from the 16th to the 22nd of May, or as part of our new campaign, Unled Ecosystem Invaders. So this will launch on May the 22nd at the National Botanic Garden of Wales. And then it's also really important that we all practice good biosecurity, whether this be in our gardens by following Be Plant Wise, or by following Check, Clean, Dry, whether as a recreational water user, or just following the principles of Check, Clean, Dry when we're out and about. For example, by cleaning our boots after walks to make sure we're not spreading any plant fragments, diseases, or seeds around. So yeah, sorry for going through this so quickly. Thought I would be a bit slower, but thank you all for listening. If you want to find out any more about our project, please do visit our webpage in the North Wales Wildlife Trust website, or you can email me directly. And then if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.